Hi, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. My name is Joe Murphy. I'm a lawyer with the Allegheny Immigration Group in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Our telephone number is 412-586-4131. My practice is primarily humanitarian and family-based immigration. And I want to talk today about a subject I've been getting a lot of inquiries on, and that is the subject of asylum claims. There are two ways asylum claims can be asserted. One is what's called defensively. That is, the government seeks to deport someone, and during the course of that proceeding, the person to be deported would assert a claim for asylum as a defense to deportation. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. Today I'm going to talk about what's called an affirmative application for asylum, and that's where the person who's applying for asylum doesn't do that in response to some action of the government, but does it on their own. That's done on an application for asylum, and in that you're going to have to set forth the basis of your claim for asylum. Normally, the basis of an asylum claim would be that you're coming from a country where you're subject to persecution at the hands of the government. Over the last 8 or 9 years, there have been some people that believe that asylum claims can be asserted simply because the country you come from is a poor country, or because the country is unstable or at war. Those are sometimes entertained by the different asylum offices and courts around the country, but as a general matter, the persecution you're suffering has to be by the government of the country you're coming from, and it has to be on account of what's called one of the protected bases: race, religion, sexual orientation, political affiliation, membership in social groups. So if the government's persecuting everyone in the country, that's not a claim for asylum. They have to be, so to speak, picking on you because of your membership in a particular protected class. Now, my office, my home office is in Pittsburgh, so when you file an asylum claim, and if you live in the Northeast, those claims are heard in Arlington, Virginia, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. You'll file your claim, you'll get a receipt for filing. You'll be legal to stay in the country as an applicant for asylee until that claim is adjudicated, either denied or granted. You're eligible to apply for a work authorization 180 days after your claim is filed and has not been resolved. And if they don't grant it within 150 days after the application, there are things you can do to force the service to issue a work authorization. But here you'll get your notice, and at some point in time after that, you will be called down to the Arlington Asylum Office, and that's again in Arlington, Virginia. It's a pretty nice high-rise building with all sorts of security features. A lot of asylum claims are heard there on a daily basis. They're very busy. They have a published phone number and email address, but it seems that no one ever answers at any of those. It's very, very difficult to get in touch with them, reschedule things. It's almost impossible. Now, the regulations say that you should be down there in 45 days from filing. In practice, it can take years. And when you do get there, you want to be prepared for a day waiting. There's a lot of people waiting. There's a lot of people who are nervous. They speak different languages. There's no real good supply of clean water. The bathroom's always a mess down there. So be prepared. Bring some snacks, a bottle of water. If you have children with you, you might want to consider bringing enough for them, or an iPad or something to keep them busy, because it's incredibly boring. But as you sit around there, eventually your case will be called. Now, when you're called, you'll be greeted by an asylum officer. He'll walk you back out of the waiting area into the working areas of the asylum office. There's a long curving hallway there in the Arlington office, and eventually you'll sit down with the asylum officer. Now, these guys are officers, and a lot of people are afraid of officers because they think it means the police. They're not policemen, they're officers of the United States, particularly asylum officers. So they're not going to arrest you, and they're not even asserting officer to, so to speak, intimidate you, and don't be intimidated. Most of the asylum officers are incredible. I'm always amazed with their patience, their thoroughness, and they're really great representatives of our country. I can't say enough about some of the neat things I've seen them do. But as the asylum interview starts, the asylum officer will take out what you filed and go over it. And that may seem terrifying, right? But what he's really doing is checking to make sure nothing has changed, that everything in there is accurate. Perhaps you moved or took a new job or got married. There could be all sorts of things that happen in someone's life. A question there. That might change, especially when it's taking years to even get your initial interview. But that asylum officer will be just going over the things, your date of birth, the spelling of your name, children, family members, where you're from, and any number of other things. It can be a little bit intimidating because although he's asking questions, he or she is asking questions, the asylum officer most of the time is focused on a computer, typing up what you've entered, and there's not a lot of eye contact. And so many people use eye contact as a visual cue for whether the person they're talking to is approving, disproving, understanding what they're saying, and there's very little of that with the asylum officer during an asylum interview. Again, because they're putting information in a computer, the government may use that for other similar cases and things of that nature. I had some recommendations. If you're going down from Pittsburgh, it's a 4-hour drive, and you'll be nervous and so on and so forth. So I do recommend, if you can afford it and you have the time, to go the night before. There's a great hotel that I always use there. The address is, it's the Courtyard, Arlington, Roslyn, 1533 Clarendon Boulevard. It's around $250 per night for a 2-bed hotel room. And that is literally, you just cut through the back of the hotel and you're right at the asylum office. So it's very convenient in the morning. It's clean, it's not posh. There's a little gym, there's a little bistro, there's a little bar that mercifully closes at around 10 p.m. Obviously, nervous people can get into it. If you use that sort of compensation technique, I do recommend moderation, because that's going to tap your resources. Again, if you're at an asylum interview hungover, it's going to potentially even adversely affect determination about your credibility. That's another thing you really ought to try and refrain from doing, and that's the old schmoozing with the asylum officer. Polite hello, maybe some innocent chit chat about a Cardinals game or the weather or whatever you're going to do, but don't get into trying to become buddy-buddy. That not only is a waste of time, but it may in fact make you seem as a manipulative personality type, and that could adversely affect the asylum officer's determination of your credibility. As you go through the, I've got my notes on all this here. As the asylum officer is going through your application and confirming things, he's also assessing your responses, your credibility, and looking for, so to speak, a character for lying. I mean, this is what it's about. Is this person telling the truth? So you might get questions asked about things that even aren't on the application. An example I give is if this asylum officer is going through your residential history and asks about another place. We have records that you lived at 123 Main Street. That can be very scary. It's like almost a challenge. It's not. He's just trying to verify what's going on and whether someone else used your name there, whether you actually lived there or not. And in most cases, it's no big deal. You could say, oh yeah, I stayed there for 2 weeks with my brother-in-law or something of that nature. Or no, you didn't. But the more important thing is not to let yourself be put in a position where you feel like you're being interrogated, although it really does seem that way. It's just the asylum officer trying to collect information, verify the things you've told him, told the government in your filing. A nice thing to do is to bring your own copies of your documents and your originals. So what I do with each document that supports the asylum application, that includes things as simple as the passport, the I-94 card of the applicant, birth certificate of the applicant, things of that nature. I always have in each folder the original and a copy. Whatever you give that asylum officer, he's going to want to make a copy and keep it for his records. Nice if you've actually made those for him to save him the time. It's just a little courtesy you can extend to the asylum officer that'll go a long way in terms of not wasting his or her time. one of the things you have to do before the asylum interview is biometrics. That's fingerprinting. In some cases, it's a retinal scan. You have to bring evidence that you've complied with it, and this is a trap for the unwary. I'll get into that another time, but you want to make sure that you bring that you've been fingerprinted and that they haven't expired. Let's see if I have other notes I had for your interest. After you and the asylum officer have gone over the application, corrected any inaccuracies or mistakes or any of that sort of stuff, then you get to telling your story. This is really important. You've got to let them have it. I don't want you to hold things back. You certainly can't make things up, but I wouldn't understate things. There's no benefit to that in you. Even things that are embarrassing or humiliating. Trust me, these people have heard it all, and they're not really going to be surprised. Well, it's unlikely that you would survive anything that they hadn't already heard of. But it's important you tell your story and give as much detail as possible. And there's a couple reasons. One, of course, is to advance your own interest in potentially having the officer recommend a grant of your application for asylum. More importantly, the government will use the information you give them to look for similar other claims. They may see a pattern of something developing that they weren't aware of. All that information is used by the government, and stating your claim and giving as much information as you can may not only help you, but it could help some other poor devil or deviless that you left behind in your home country that you may not even known, who was in a similar situation of persecution. But don't think, and that's another thing, but at no point here, I talked earlier about not schmoozing asylum officers, not trying to make them your friend, and how efforts to do that beyond simple polite chit-chat might be perceived as manipulative. It might adversely affect the determination of your credibility. You know, these people they're not your enemy, but they're not your buddy either. They're representatives of the United States trying to interview an applicant for an immigration benefit called asylum. This is not some buddy who's inclined to believe you, or some enemy who's inclined to disbelieve you. But you really have to give detail and don't, again, hold things back. It's very good sometimes to prepare for the interview with your lawyer. Sometimes it's not. I've had cases where people repeated the same story of an episode of abuse so many times they became desensitized to their own abuse and could recount the story. Oh yeah, I'm telling that story again, and there was no longer the real emotion in it that conveys, you know, the actual severity of what this poor person has been through. So I guess that's the point. You want to talk about these things. You might want to practice how you would present them or organize them, but you don't want to do that to such extent that you desensitize yourself and you can recite these things. It's lines from a play, and it's not what happened to you. Let's see if there's anything else that's interesting in my notes you might like. When you are talking about persecution you've suffered, you may find an asylum officer asking you, anything else? Do you have anything else? Did anything else happen to you? And you may hear that question a lot. Please don't take that to mean what you've presented isn't enough. And certainly don't take that to mean that you better fabricate something because it's not enough. You can't fabricate, you can't lie on these. It's a crime, very serious, and it'll ruin your chances of ever getting anything. But more importantly, they just want to make sure they get all the information they can out of you. And again, that relates to what I said earlier, that the information they collect can be used to analyze other cases and perhaps to help other people. If you don't have anything else, say no, you don't have anything else. But don't make things up, and don't worry that means. It means nothing one way or the other, just that the asylum officer wants to make sure that nothing he or she has said appears dismissive. Even if you have given them enough, they're going to keep asking if you have anything else, because they are primarily there to collect interviews. At the close of the interview, the officer may indicate that they're going to recommend a grant or not. They may tell you that you'll get a copy of the recommendation. None of that means anything one way or the other, but eventually you will get a written decision from the office. So again, my name is Joe Murphy. I'm a lawyer with Allegheny Immigration Group here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. practice all over this region: Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, Virginia. We have some work in Minneapolis. We work in San Francisco. So I can come to you if you need me.